The air in the lecture hall was heavy, almost suffocating. The tension wasn't just from the upcoming advanced calculus lesson. It was from something much deeper, something unspoken. The murmur of over 100 students filled the vast space, the occasional nervous chuckle breaking through the sea of whispered conversations. They all knew what kind of professor they were about to face. Professor Linda Cartwright. She was infamous. Her reputation stretched far beyond the University of Michigan, known for her unforgiving teaching style, her ruthless academic standards, and her complete lack of tolerance for anything less than perfection. A single mistake in her class didn't just mean a bad grade, it meant public humiliation. She had no patience for weakness, no time for students who couldn't keep up. And she made sure they knew it. Today, however, was different. This wasn't just another brutal lecture. Cartwright wasn't alone. The front row wasn't filled with students. It was filled with professors, some from her own department, others from prestigious universities across the country. Their faces were serious, their eyes sharp, watching, evaluating. They weren't here to learn. They were here to watch her. This was an open lecture, a demonstration of her teaching methods, a performance to showcase why she was one of the most respected and feared mathematics professors in the country. And then there was him, Daniel Reed, sitting in the middle row, hood up, fingers lazily spinning a pen between them. He wasn't talking to anyone. He didn't look nervous. He barely moved. But the moment his presence was noticed, the air changed. Not among the students, among the professors. Professor Whitaker, a senior lecturer with decades of experience, leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, a smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. His gaze locked onto Daniel with an almost amused expression. "Look at that," he murmured, nudging the professor beside him. "A black kid in advanced calculus." The professor next to him chuckled, shaking his head. "He won't last," another added, barely bothering to lower his voice. They weren't discussing the upcoming lecture. They weren't analyzing the complexity of the course material. They were talking about Daniel, not his ability, not his intelligence, his skin. The laughter wasn't loud, but it was enough. Enough for Daniel to hear. Enough for the students around him to hear. He didn't react. He never did. He was used to this. It had been like this his whole life. Teachers underestimating him, classmates side-eyeing him, professors assuming he didn't belong before he even spoke a word. He had learned a long time ago that there was no point in arguing. Numbers were his argument. Mathematics was his voice. And today, it would speak louder than ever. The murmur in the room quieted, all heads turning as sharp, deliberate footsteps echoed against the marble floor. Cartwright had arrived. A hush fell over the room. She didn't need to demand silence. She was silence. With her straight posture, silver-rimmed glasses, and an expression as cold as steel, she commanded attention the moment she stepped inside. She didn't have to shout, didn't have to enforce authority. Her mere presence was enough. She stood at the front of the room, taking her time as she scanned the students, her gaze like a judge evaluating who was worthy and who was a waste of space. Some students looked down, avoiding eye contact. Cartwright didn't tolerate mediocrity. She had no patience for those who fell behind. Then, her eyes landed on him. Daniel. She didn't pause long, didn't let her gaze linger. But the message was clear. A flicker of something passed through her expression. Not curiosity, not interest. Dismissal. As if she had already decided he didn't belong. Then, without a word, she turned to the board, picked up a piece of chalk, and began to write. Dense equations appeared, sharp and precise, filling the board with a complex web of mathematical symbols. "Last week," she said, her voice crisp and controlled, "we studied multivariable limits." The chalk continued to move, unrelenting. "Today, we move on to Laplace transforms." A collective sigh rippled through the students. Laplace transforms were brutal. They weren't just another topic, they were a barrier, the kind of mathematical concept that separated the weak from the strong. Some students were already struggling, flipping through their notes in panic. Cartwright didn't slow down. If you couldn't keep up, that was your problem. At the front, the guest professors nodded approvingly. They admired her style, not just her intelligence, but her ruthlessness. In the middle row, Daniel remained motionless. He didn't take notes. He didn't need to. Instead, he watched. His eyes scanned the board, his mind working faster than the chalk in Cartwright's hand. And then, he saw it. A mistake. A tiny mistake. Almost invisible. But to Daniel, it was like a flashing red light. A small miscalculation in how the transform was applied. The kind of mistake that wouldn't be obvious at first. But if left uncorrected, the final result would be completely wrong. He glanced around. No one had noticed. The students were too busy copying, too afraid to question. Cartwright, completely unaware. Daniel hesitated. He knew what would happen if he spoke up. Cartwright didn't take kindly to being corrected, especially not in front of an audience, especially not by a student like him. He could let it slide, stay silent. It wasn't his problem if no one else saw it. But that thought made him feel sick. He hated arrogance. He hated people who believed they could never be wrong. And most of all, he hated people who looked down on others just because they didn't look like them. He exhaled slowly. Then, he raised his hand. "Professor," he said, his voice steady, cutting through the silence. "There's a mistake in the transformation." The room froze. Cartwright stopped writing. Every head turned. The air went cold. And then, she smiled. Not a kind smile, not a warm smile. A predator's smile. The kind that said, "You just made the worst mistake of your life." The guest professors exchanged amused glances. One of them leaned toward Whitaker and whispered, "He just dug his own grave." Whitaker chuckled, folding his arms. "Watch him crumble." Cartwright turned slowly, her eyes locking onto Daniel. "A mistake," she repeated. She glanced at the board, making a show of inspecting her own work. Then she looked back at him. "Are you sure?" A challenge, an unspoken threat. Daniel didn't blink. "Yes," he said. "I'm sure." The smirk on Cartwright's lips faded. For the first time, she hesitated. Just for a fraction of a second. And then, her expression hardened. She picked up the chalk and extended it toward him. "Then fix it." The class erupted. Laughter, whispers, excited murmurs. Because they all knew what this was. This wasn't a chance. This was a trap. A public execution. Daniel stood, calm, unshaken. He walked to the board, took the chalk from Cartwright's hand, and with a few simple strokes, he proved them all wrong. The silence was deafening. No one moved. No one breathed. The only sound was the soft scrape of chalk against the board as Daniel corrected the mistake. Clean, precise strokes. No hesitation. No uncertainty. The equation transformed under his hand, shifting into something clearer, something undeniable. For the first few seconds, the students just watched in stunned silence. Most of them didn't even know what they were looking at, until they glanced back at their own notes, then at the board, then back again. Slowly, the realization crept in. He was right. A murmur spread across the room. The students who had been blindly copying the incorrect equation started flipping back through their notes, some frowning, some blinking in disbelief. A professor in the front row, one of Cartwright's invited guests, narrowed his eyes at the board. His head tilted slightly, his brows furrowing as he processed what he was seeing. Professor Whitaker's smirk had vanished. Cartwright, however, remained perfectly still, arms crossed over her chest, her expression unreadable. Daniel finished the last stroke, set the chalk down, and turned around. His face was calm, no smugness, no arrogance, just quiet certainty. He didn't need to gloat. The numbers spoke for themselves. The silence stretched on. And then, finally, someone in the back exhaled. A soft whisper rippled through the rows of students. Someone muttered, "Holy shit!" Another, in pure disbelief, said, "Wait, did that actually just happen?" Cartwright blinked. For the briefest moment, something flickered across her face. Annoyance? Frustration? Something else. Something she wasn't used to feeling. Doubt. Her gaze flicked back to the board, then to Daniel, as if searching for a way to dismiss what had just happened. She found nothing. One of the guest professors leaned toward Whitaker and whispered, "Well, that was unexpected." Whitaker's jaw tightened. He didn't respond. Cartwright finally broke the silence. "Not bad," she said. Her tone was controlled, but there was no warmth, no real acknowledgement. It was a deflection, a way to move on without admitting anything. Daniel simply nodded. He didn't need her approval. Cartwright turned back to the board, but she wasn't done. This wasn't over. She picked up the chalk and, without looking at him, began writing again. A new problem. A much harder problem. Faster this time, her movements sharper, almost aggressive. She was raising the stakes. This wasn't just about correcting a mistake anymore. This was war. The problem stretched across the board, longer, denser, far beyond anything they had covered in class. Students' faces fell. Some of them glanced at each other. Others shook their heads, already lost. Cartwright set the chalk down, then turned to face him. Her arms crossed, her eyes cold. "If you're really as capable as you think," she said, "solve this one." The whispers in the classroom exploded. "Is she serious?" "That's not a class-level problem. This isn't a test, it's a setup." Daniel just stood there, still calm, still unmoved. He walked back to the board. Cartwright didn't smirk this time. She simply watched, waiting for him to fail. The guest professors leaned forward, intrigued. Even Whitaker, who had been irritated just moments before, now looked slightly amused again. Daniel studied the problem for a moment. Then, he picked up the chalk, and he began to write. The students held their breath. At first, some of them thought he was just trying to appear confident, that he'd slow down once he realized what he was up against. But he didn't. His strokes were steady. Every number, every transformation flowed seamlessly onto the board. It was like he wasn't solving the problem. He was translating something he already knew. No hesitation. No second guessing. Halfway through, the murmurs in the room stopped. People were watching. Really watching. Even Cartwright's fingers had tightened slightly around her arms. Because she knew the rhythm of hesitation. She had seen hundreds, thousands of students struggle before. Daniel wasn't struggling. Whitaker leaned forward, his smugness gone. Daniel's writing filled the board, clean and efficient. By the time he reached the final step, even the guest professors were watching in stunned silence. One of them adjusted his glasses. Another glanced at Cartwright. Daniel placed the chalk back on the tray. He turned. And for the second time that day, the room was dead silent. No one needed to check. No one needed to second guess. It was perfect. One of the guest professors let out a quiet whistle. "Jesus." A student in the back muttered, "That was insane." Another, stunned, said, "He didn't even pause." Cartwright inhaled slowly through her nose. She had lost this round, but she refused to let it end like this. "Well then," she said smoothly, picking up the chalk again. "If you're really this talented, why don't you prove it on a bigger stage?" Daniel blinked. The class leaned in, confused. "There's a national math competition next month," she continued, "where the brightest minds from top universities compete. If you think you're as exceptional as you appear, you should enter." The classroom exploded. "No way, that's for grad students. He just got here, there's no chance. She's setting him up." Daniel didn't react to the noise. He kept his eyes on her. She wanted him to hesitate. She wanted him to second-guess himself. Instead, he simply said, "All right, I'll do it." The class fell silent. A few students gasped. One actually laughed in disbelief. Cartwright hadn't expected that. She had expected him to hesitate, maybe laugh it off, say something about not being ready. But he had just agreed, without a second thought. For the first time, Cartwright felt something unfamiliar, a tiny seed of uncertainty. Had she just made a mistake? Whitaker frowned. This kid, he actually thinks he can win. Cartwright's jaw clenched slightly. "We'll see," she murmured. Because if Daniel had agreed to step into this world, he was about to realize something. It wasn't just about being good at math. This was about pressure, reputation. And in the world of academia, where names and connections meant everything, Daniel Reed was about to enter a battlefield where no one wanted to see him succeed. The air inside the grand auditorium of the University of Pennsylvania was electric. Rows upon rows of chairs stretched across the massive space, each occupied by some of the most brilliant mathematical minds in the country. The best students from MIT, Stanford, Princeton, Harvard, Caltech, all gathered in the same room, each radiating an air of quiet confidence. This wasn't just another test. This was the National Mathematics Competition, where only the most elite, the most gifted, the most unshakable would emerge victorious. For most of the competitors, this wasn't their first time here. They had been preparing for years. They had trained under world-class mathematicians, been mentored by the sharpest minds in academia. Some of them had been solving high-level equations since they were 10 years old. None of them had expected to see him. Daniel Reed, sitting in the middle row, hood up, completely still. His face unreadable. His name had spread through the halls of the University of Michigan like wildfire after his confrontation with Professor Cartwright. Some called him a prodigy, others dismissed him as just a lucky freshman who had bitten off more than he could chew. Today there would be no more rumors, no more speculation, because today the numbers would speak for themselves. Across the room, Professor Cartwright sat alongside the judges' panel, her sharp gaze sweeping over the competitors. She didn't look at Daniel. Not yet. She was waiting for him to fail. She had engineered this moment. She knew how these competitions worked. The problems weren't just difficult. They were psychological warfare. The pressure of the clock, the suffocating intensity of the brightest minds competing against one another, the weight of expectation, of knowing that one mistake could cost everything. Daniel wasn't ready for this. He couldn't be. She was certain. Professor Whitaker sat further back, his arms crossed, watching intently. He had spent weeks telling his colleagues that Daniel would crumble the second he stepped into a real academic arena. Now, all he had to do was wait. The announcer's voice rang through the speakers, pulling the room into a dead silence. "Welcome, contestants, to the final round of the National Mathematics Competition." A murmur of anticipation rippled through the audience. "You are the best of the best. But today, we will find out who is the very best." A giant screen at the front of the auditorium flickered to life. The first problem appeared. It was immediate. The moment the numbers filled the screen, The sound of furious scribbling erupted throughout the room. Pens scratching against paper. Fingers flying across keyboards. Some students froze, their eyes scanning the problem, breaking it down in their minds before daring to write a single number. Others rushed in too quickly, writing frantically, then pausing as doubt crept into their calculations. Daniel? He simply picked up his pen, and he wrote. No hesitation, no second guessing. His strokes were clean, deliberate. It was like watching someone copy down an answer they had already memorized. A professor from Princeton leaned toward one of the judges. "Who is that?" he whispered, watching Daniel's rapid movements. The judge frowned, flipping through his roster. "Daniel Reed, University of Michigan." The Princeton professor raised an eyebrow. Never heard of him. A few rows over, an MIT competitor glanced up from his own paper, noticing how quickly Daniel was moving. His brow furrowed. No way he's that fast. One by one, other competitors started stealing glances. They didn't want to admit it, but they were falling behind. Even the ones from the most prestigious universities were still stuck on the first transformation, while Daniel was already halfway through the problem. Cartwright noticed. Her eyes narrowed. This wasn't supposed to happen. Whitaker leaned forward in his chair, his fingers tapping against the desk. For the first time, he felt uneasy. Because Daniel wasn't just keeping up. He was leading. The second problem appeared on the screen, then the third, then the fourth. One by one, competitors started to drop off, pausing to double-check their work, erasing mistakes, realizing they had taken the wrong approach. Daniel? He never stopped. His writing was relentless, clean, precise. It wasn't just skill, it was certainty. Cartwright folded her arms. She refused to let her expression change, but she could feel it. Something was wrong. The pressure wasn't breaking him, it was fueling him. Another problem appeared. The complexity jumped. Triple integrals, non-linear differential equations, abstract algebra. This was where most students panicked, where even the best of the best slowed down. But Daniel, he just kept writing. A visiting professor leaned toward Whitaker, whispering under his breath. "This kid, he's not normal." Whitaker said nothing, because for the first time, he had nothing to say. And then, the final question appeared. The most difficult problem in the entire competition. It wasn't just advanced. It was designed to break people. A labyrinth of variables, an equation so deeply complex that even some of the judges would struggle with it. A PhD candidate from MIT, one of the top-ranked competitors, visibly stiffened. He glanced at the problem, his eyes narrowing. He took a deep breath. Then he picked up his pen. It was a race now. Him and Daniel. Every other competitor had stopped. Some leaned back in their chairs, defeated. Others watched, unable to believe what was happening. Whitaker clenched his jaw. Cartwright's grip on her pen tightened. Daniel's expression never changed. Not once. He studied the problem for a second. Then, he started to write, faster than before, faster than anyone in the room. The MIT competitor pushed forward, his hand moving just as quickly, his mind racing. He had never lost a competition before. He wasn't about to start now. Lines of calculations filled their pages, two minds moving at the speed of lightning. The audience held their breath. The judges leaned forward. And then, Daniel stopped. He put his pen down, his hands folded. He sat back, finished. The MIT competitor was still writing. Cartwright's eyes widened. One of the judges stood, walking over to Daniel's desk. He picked up the paper, examined it, checked every line. He looked up, his expression stunned. He turned to the other judges, nodded. Then, he spoke. "We have a winner." The room erupted. The room erupted in whispers. Some of the students were still flipping through their own papers, trying to process what had just happened. Others sat frozen in their seats, stunned into absolute silence. In the front row, the MIT competitor was still writing. He hadn't even realized what had happened yet, until a low murmur rippled through the audience. Slowly, as if sensing the shift in energy, he glanced up, and his heart sank. The judge had already made his way to the front of the room. The results had been decided. Daniel had finished first. The realization hit like a hammer. The competitor's hand tightened around his pen for just a second before he let out a slow breath, set it down, and leaned back. His face was unreadable, but his shoulders slumped just slightly. He knew it was over. The whispers grew louder, murmurs of disbelief mixing with admiration. Did he really just beat everyone? That was the final problem. No way he solved it that fast. MIT dude was supposed to win this. One of the guest professors stood, walked to the front, and leaned over Daniel's paper. He scanned the page, his eyes darting through each line. Then he checked it again. Then a third time. No mistakes, no miscalculations. Not only had Daniel finished first, but he had solved the problem in a way none of the other competitors had even considered. The professor turned, whispering something to the other judges. Their heads nodded in agreement, their expressions shifting from confusion to something else. Awe. Cartwright's jaw clenched so hard that a muscle twitched at the edge of her mouth. This was supposed to be his breaking point. She had brought him here to watch him fail. Instead, she had just watched him do the impossible. Whitaker sat completely still, fingers digging into his armrest. He wasn't smirking anymore. His usual smugness had been replaced by something he didn't like to admit. Fear. Not fear of Daniel, no. Fear of what this meant. Because Daniel wasn't supposed to exist. A kid with no connections. No special academic background. No elite private tutors. And yet, he had just walked into one of the most prestigious math competitions in the country and crushed students who had spent their entire lives training for it. There was no excuse they could make. No way to twist the truth. No way to take this victory from him. The judge at the front cleared his throat. The murmurs in the room stopped. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying across the auditorium, "we have a winner." A pause, a heavy silence. Then, "The winner of the National Mathematics Competition is Daniel Reed." The reaction was instant. Some students gasped out loud. Others leaned forward as if they hadn't heard correctly. A few students from smaller universities started clapping, almost uncertainly at first. But then the applause grew louder, swelling through the room. It wasn't the kind of polite clapping that usually happened at these events. It was genuine, respectful. Because what they had just witnessed was something legendary. Daniel remained seated, unmoved. He didn't stand. He didn't celebrate. He didn't need to. He had already known the outcome the moment he put his pen down. For him, the numbers had spoken. Cartwright's nails pressed into her palm as she forced herself to maintain a neutral expression. But she could feel it. The weight of her own failure. The sting of realizing that despite everything, she had been wrong. For the first time in her career, she had looked down on a student, and that student had just humiliated her in front of the entire academic world. Whitaker slowly exhaled, his fingers tapping against his desk in frustration. He wanted to say something, make an excuse, find a flaw, but there wasn't one. Daniel had won, and they all knew it. One of the guest professors from Princeton turned to the judges' panel and muttered under his breath, "We need to keep an eye on this kid." Another professor from Stanford was already writing something down in a notebook, eyes glancing at Daniel like he had just witnessed the rise of a new legend. But Daniel, he just sat there, composed, like this was just another problem he had solved in class. Because to him, it was. The next morning, back at the University of Michigan, the atmosphere was different. Word had spread. The whispers had turned into full-blown discussions in every hallway, every classroom. Students who had never paid attention to Daniel before were now staring at him. Some in awe, some in disbelief, and some in fear. Because Daniel hadn't just won the competition, he had shattered a system that had told him, before he even set foot in that lecture hall, that he didn't belong, that he wasn't good enough, that he would fail. He had taken that system, crushed it under the weight of pure talent, and left nothing but silence in its wake. When Cartwright entered her lecture hall that morning, the energy was unlike anything before. Students weren't sitting with their usual nervous postures. They weren't flipping through notes in a desperate attempt to prepare. They were waiting for her to acknowledge the undeniable truth. She placed her materials on the desk, adjusted her glasses, and for the first time in her career, she hesitated. Then, after a long pause, she spoke. "Before we begin today's lecture," she said, voice level, controlled, "I want to say one thing." The entire class held their breath. She glanced toward Daniel. Daniel Reed has proven that talent has no skin color. The room was silent, not because they didn't understand what had just happened, but because they did. Cartwright didn't say more. She didn't praise him. She didn't try to justify herself. She simply turned, picked up her chalk, and began writing the lesson on the board. But everyone in the room knew. Things had changed, forever. Some students turned to Daniel, expecting a reaction, a smirk, a look of satisfaction. But he just nodded, flipping open his notebook. Because to him, this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning.